There is a particular kind of anxiety that rarely looks like anxiety. It looks like saying yes when you want to say no. It looks like answering messages when you're exhausted. Agreeing with opinions you don't actually share. Taking responsibility for problems you didn't create. Staying quiet when someone crosses a boundary because speaking up might make the room uncomfortable. And sometimes, it looks like spending your entire life becoming the person everyone else finds easy to love. From the outside, this can look like kindness. But psychologically, something much more complicated may be happening underneath. You may not simply be afraid of disappointing people. You may be afraid of what their disappointment seems to mean about you. Think about the last time someone important to you was disappointed. Maybe your parents expected something different. Maybe your partner wanted you to make another choice. Maybe your boss asked for something when you were already overwhelmed. Maybe a friend needed you at exactly the moment you needed space. Before you even answered, your body probably reacted. A small tension in your chest, a strange heaviness in your stomach. And then the mind began negotiating. Maybe I should just do it. It isn't that big of a deal. I don't want them to think I'm selfish. What if they're angry? What if they stop liking me? Notice how quickly a simple decision becomes a question about belonging. This isn't accidental. Human beings evolved in groups where acceptance was extraordinarily important. For most of human history, being rejected by your community wasn't merely uncomfortable. It could reduce access to protection, resources, cooperation, and survival. So your nervous system became highly sensitive to social signals. A disappointed expression, a change in someone's voice, a moment of silence, a message that suddenly feels colder than usual. Your rational mind may understand that none of these things are dangerous, but an older part of your brain can interpret them very differently. Something is wrong. You may be losing connection. Fix it. And one of the fastest ways to restore connection is compliance. Say yes. Apologize. Explain yourself. Change your decision. Make them happy again. The relief can be immediate. Someone smiles. The tension disappears. The relationship feels safe again. And your brain learns something important. When other people are happy with me, I am safe. This is where a pattern can quietly begin. Psychologists often describe people-pleasing not simply as excessive kindness, but as behavior that can be connected to approval-seeking, conflict avoidance, rejection sensitivity, and difficulty maintaining interpersonal boundaries. And those patterns often develop long before adulthood. Imagine a child discovering that certain versions of themselves receive more warmth. Being helpful earns praise. Being successful earns attention. Being agreeable prevents arguments. Being quiet prevents criticism. Being easy makes adults happy. The child doesn't consciously think, I will now construct an identity around external approval. They simply adapt. Children are remarkably good at learning emotional rules without anyone explaining those rules aloud. And one of those rules might become, don't disappoint people. Because disappointment means something bad might happen. Maybe affection disappears. Maybe someone becomes angry. Maybe the atmosphere changes. Maybe you feel guilty. Years later, the circumstances are completely different, but the rule remains. You're 30 years old, and saying no to an invitation somehow feels dangerous. You're capable, independent, and responsible, yet telling your parents you've chosen a different path makes you feel 12 again. You know your coworker's request is unreasonable, but refusing still produces guilt. The threat is no longer physical. Sometimes it isn't even relational. The threat has become psychological. If they are disappointed in me, maybe I am disappointing. That distinction matters. Because now another person's temporary emotion has become evidence about your identity. And once that happens, you begin managing other people's feelings as though they were your responsibility. But there is a problem. Other people's expectations have no natural ending. One person wants you to work harder. Another wants you to relax. Your family wants stability. You want adventure. Your boss wants availability. Your body wants rest. Your friends want your time. Your ambitions want your attention. You cannot satisfy every expectation because many of those expectations contradict each other. So eventually, something has to be disappointed. The question is, why are you so often willing to make that something you? And this is where Stoicism introduces a distinction that can completely change the way you understand disappointment. Other people's expectations belong to them. Your choices belong to you. That sounds simple. Living it is much harder. Because the moment you stop managing everyone's expectations, you encounter something you've spent years trying to avoid: their disappointment. And perhaps the real path toward freedom begins when you discover that someone can be disappointed in you, and you can still be okay. But what happens when avoiding disappointment becomes one of the organizing principles of your life? At first, the consequences seem small. You attend a dinner when you wanted to stay home. You accept another task at work. You answer the phone even though you need silence. You apologize simply to end an argument. Each decision seems insignificant. But small decisions repeated for years eventually become a life. And this is where people-pleasing becomes expensive. Because every time you automatically protect someone else from disappointment, you may be teaching yourself that their comfort matters more than your honesty. Imagine that someone asks you for a favor. You don't want to do it. Maybe you're exhausted. Maybe you don't have time. Maybe you simply don't want to. Immediately, two voices appear. The first says, "I don't want to do this." The second says, "But they'll be disappointed." For many people, the second voice wins almost automatically. You say yes, and something interesting happens. For a moment, you feel relief. There will be no uncomfortable conversation, no awkward silence, no possibility of being judged. The anxiety disappears. Psychologically, this matters. When a behavior removes discomfort, the brain becomes more likely to repeat that behavior. So saying yes doesn't merely satisfy the other person, it also removes your own fear. And gradually, avoidance becomes a habit. You aren't necessarily choosing what you want anymore. You're choosing whatever produces the least immediate interpersonal tension. But immediate peace can create long-term resentment. Because the emotion you avoided doesn't disappear. It often changes form. You say yes, then feel irritated. You offer help, then secretly wish they hadn't asked. You agree to plans, then hope they get canceled. You tell everyone you're fine, then wonder why nobody seems to understand what you need. This creates a painful paradox. You become angry that people don't respect boundaries you never clearly communicated. And eventually, you may begin believing that everyone asks too much from you. Sometimes they do, but sometimes they simply learned that you always say yes. This is why boundaries are so uncomfortable for chronic people pleasers. A boundary creates the exact experience they have spent years avoiding. Someone might be unhappy. Someone might disagree. Someone might think you're difficult. Someone might even leave. So instead of asking, "Is this reasonable for me?" the mind asks, "How will they react?" And suddenly your decisions are being made inside someone else's imagined emotional world. The Stoics would recognize the problem immediately. Epictetus repeatedly separated what belongs to us from what does not. Your intentions belong to you. Your actions belong to you. Your values belong to you. Another person's interpretation does not. Their disappointment does not. Their approval does not. Their emotional reaction does not. That doesn't mean becoming careless about other people. There is an enormous difference between compassion and responsibility for another person's emotional state. You can care that someone is disappointed without believing you must eliminate their disappointment. You can listen without surrendering your decision. You can understand without agreeing. You can love someone and still tell them no. Consider a simple example. A friend asks you to attend an event. You are exhausted and genuinely need rest. You decline. Your friend sounds disappointed. Immediately, guilt appears. The old pattern says, "Fix this," but pause. What actually happened? You communicated an honest limitation. Your friend experienced disappointment. Both things can exist at the same time. Their disappointment doesn't automatically prove that your boundary was wrong. This is one of the hardest lessons for people who are used to being liked. Someone can feel negatively about your decision without your decision being morally wrong. Discomfort is not always evidence of wrongdoing. Sometimes discomfort is simply the price of honesty. And this is where guilt becomes especially confusing. Many people assume that if they feel guilty, they must have done something wrong. But feelings aren't court verdicts. Sometimes guilt appears because you violated your values. And sometimes guilt appears because you violated an old pattern. Those are completely different things. If you've spent 20 years automatically saying yes, the first honest no may feel terrible. Not because the no is wrong, because it is unfamiliar. Your nervous system may interpret a healthy boundary as danger simply because it has little experience with one. And this is why change often feels worse before it feels better. You begin speaking more honestly. Some people are surprised. You stop explaining every decision. Some people become uncomfortable. You become less available. Someone may call you selfish. And suddenly you wonder whether becoming healthier has made you a worse person. But perhaps another question is more useful. Were they benefiting from the version of you that had no boundaries? Because when you change a pattern, everyone who benefited from that pattern must adjust. Some will respect the change. Others will resist it. Neither reaction determines whether the change was necessary. Marcus Aurelius constantly returned to character rather than reputation. Not, did everyone approve of what I did, but was what I did reasonable, honest, and consistent with the person I intend to be? That creates a completely different foundation for decision-making. You can disappoint someone and still be kind. You can disappoint someone and still be fair. You can disappoint someone and still love them. And sometimes, disappointing someone is unavoidable if you are finally going to stop disappointing yourself. So how do you actually stop being afraid of disappointing people? Not by becoming indifferent. Not by convincing yourself that nobody's opinion matters. And certainly not by turning selfishness into a philosophy. The goal is much quieter. You learn to tolerate the possibility that someone may be unhappy with you without immediately abandoning yourself to make the discomfort disappear. Think about learning to swim. At first, the water feels threatening. Your body becomes tense. You desperately search for something to hold. But eventually, you discover something surprising. The water was not asking you to fight it. The more violently you struggle, the more exhausted you become. Learning to float requires something that initially feels dangerous. You stop fighting long enough to discover that you can remain above the surface. Disappointing people can feel remarkably similar. The first time you say no without inventing an excuse, your nervous system may panic. The first time you disagree openly, you may replay the conversation afterward. The first time you stop explaining yourself, silence may feel almost unbearable. Your mind will whisper, "They think you're selfish. You should send another message. Maybe you were too harsh. Fix it." But this is the moment that matters. Because every time you experience someone else's disappointment without immediately trying to remove it, your brain receives new information. Disappointment is uncomfortable, but it is survivable. Someone can disagree with me and the relationship can continue. Someone can misunderstand me and I can continue living. Someone can dislike my decision and I don't have to become a different person. Gradually, the alarm becomes quieter. Not because people stop becoming disappointed, because disappointment stops meaning danger. This is emotional resilience. And it doesn't require dramatic confrontation. Sometimes it begins with sentences almost embarrassingly simple. "I can't do that today. That doesn't work for me. I understand why you're disappointed. I've decided to do something different." Notice what these sentences don't contain. A courtroom defense, a 10-minute explanation, an attempt to control the other person's reaction. You communicate. Then you allow reality to unfold. This is difficult because explanations often feel like kindness. Sometimes they are. But excessive explanation can also become negotiation. You give someone 5 reasons for your boundary. They challenge reason number 1. So you defend reason number 2. They question reason number 3. Soon you're no longer communicating a decision. You're applying for permission. And perhaps one of the most important sentences you can learn is, "They don't have to agree." That doesn't mean their perspective is worthless. Feedback matters. Relationships require compromise. Sometimes another person's disappointment reveals that we genuinely behaved selfishly or carelessly. Emotional maturity means being willing to examine that possibility. But examination is different from automatic surrender. Ask yourself, did I violate one of my values? Was I dishonest? Was I unnecessarily cruel? Did I break a commitment I freely made? If the answer is yes, repair what you can. Apologize. Learn. Change your behavior. But if the only evidence against your decision is that someone didn't like it, pause before treating their disappointment as proof of guilt. This is where Stoicism becomes extraordinarily practical. The Stoics didn't ask us to control outcomes. They asked us to take responsibility for our contribution to them. You cannot guarantee that everyone understands you. You can communicate honestly. You cannot guarantee that nobody feels disappointed. You can act with consideration. You cannot guarantee approval. You can protect your character. And ironically, this often creates healthier relationships. Because relationships built on constant compliance aren't entirely honest. If someone only knows the version of you that never disagrees, never refuses, never asks for space, and never expresses inconvenient needs, do they actually know you? Real intimacy requires the possibility of disappointment. Two independent people will eventually want different things. They will disagree. They will misunderstand each other. They will occasionally say no. A relationship capable of surviving those moments becomes stronger. A relationship that requires permanent self-erasure was never providing real safety in the first place. Perhaps this is why boundaries eventually reveal something important. They don't simply show other people where your limits are. They show you which relationships can tolerate the existence of your limits. Some people will adjust. Some will respect you more. Some may become distant. And yes, that can hurt. Freedom doesn't guarantee that nobody leaves. It means you stop making abandonment of yourself the price of preventing everyone else from leaving. There may come a moment when someone you deeply love looks at you and says, "I'm disappointed in you." Your old instinct may immediately return. Explain, apologize, change direction, make everything okay. Instead, pause. Listen carefully. Consider whether there is something useful in what they're saying, and then ask yourself one final question. If nobody approved of this decision, would I still believe it was the right thing to do? That question isn't easy, but neither is living an entire life according to other people's expectations. Eventually, you realize that disappointing people is unavoidable. Choose one path and someone will prefer another. Set one boundary and someone will wish it didn't exist. Become one version of yourself and someone will miss who you used to be. You cannot prevent disappointment. You can only decide whose disappointment will determine your life. And perhaps becoming free was never about reaching a place where nobody is disappointed in you. Perhaps it is reaching a place where you can remain compassionate when they are disappointed, remain open when they disagree, remain willing to learn when they criticize, and still remain loyal to the values you have chosen. Because sometimes the kindest thing you can do is say yes. Sometimes the wisest thing you can do is compromise. And sometimes the most honest thing you can do is disappoint someone. Not because you stopped caring about them, but because you finally understood that caring about someone should never require disappearing from your own life.